Hi.
This is my first time posting, so bear with me. I've got a lot to get off my chest, and honestly, I just need to lay it all out somewhere. My name's Ross. A few months back, I was on top of things. I'd worked at UniG, a big company where I'd climbed the ranks over the years, feeling pretty solid in my career. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid well, and I took pride in what I did. I thought my life was set. My wife, Kimberly, and I had been together for years, and while things had been rough now and then, I figured that's how marriages go. She used to be my rock, you know? I always thought we'd get through anything. Then it all went south fast. First, I lost my job. Out of nowhere, too. One day, I'm part of the team, and the next, I'm in a meeting with HR, getting told they're going in a new direction. I felt blindsided. Years of work just gone. They gave me some severance pay, but it barely made a dent in the panic that settled in. I came home, hoping Kimberly would understand, that she'd comfort me, but she was distant, cold even. At first, I thought maybe it was shock or worry, but this went on for days, then weeks. She stopped looking at me like she used to, hardly even talked to me, just the basics. Did you pay the bills? Are you looking for work? Real robotic, like we were roommates more than anything else. One night, I brought up the idea of us spending more time together, maybe taking a small trip to shake off the tension. She shrugged it off, said she was busy with work. That was her excuse more often than not, and every time I'd ask about her day or what was going on, she'd shut down. I could feel her slipping away from me, but every time I tried to grab hold, she'd pull back harder. Then one evening, I confronted her about it. I asked straight up if there was something wrong, if she wasn't happy. That's when she dropped the bombshell. She wanted a divorce. Said she needed freedom and excitement, that she felt trapped. She practically brushed off everything we'd built together, like it was nothing. I was left standing there, stunned. It felt like the ground opened up beneath me. After that night, I reached out to Irene. She was an old friend, my assistant back at UniG, and honestly, she was one of the few people who actually cared. I told her what was going on, and she was there for me, listening and offering whatever advice she could. It was Irene who got me thinking, helped me start piecing things together. I'll explain more later, but let's just say that her insights opened my eyes to things I hadn't wanted to see. So, after Kimberly said she wanted a divorce, my mind went numb. It was like everything I thought I knew about my life just flipped upside down. I couldn't sleep that night, just kept replaying her words in my head. Freedom, excitement, trapped. All the things I thought I was doing right, apparently, were just keeping her stuck. I got up early the next day, trying to pull myself together. I went back to the basics, made coffee, scrambled some eggs, acted like everything was fine. But she was different. She walked around like a stranger in our home, didn't even say good morning, just left early like she couldn't stand to be there. That was the moment it hit me. She'd already checked out of our marriage. Probably had for a while. When I talked to Irene later, she was sympathetic but straightforward. She told me, Ross, I don't want to stir the pot, but have you thought about why she's acting this way? I told her it was because I lost my job, that maybe Kimberly was embarrassed or disappointed in me. Irene didn't seem convinced. She just nodded, but there was this look on her face like she knew something I didn't. Look, she said, sometimes people drift apart, but this doesn't sound like that. It sounds like she's got one foot out the door and doesn't care that you're watching. I took a deep breath and finally asked, do you think she's seeing someone else? Just saying it out loud made my stomach twist. But Irene didn't flinch. I don't know, Ross. But if it walks like a duck, you know. I didn't want to believe it. I mean, we'd been married for years. We had our problems, but I thought we were still solid at the end of the day. Still, that conversation planted a seed. I started noticing things that hadn't made sense before. The late work nights, the extra time she spent on her phone, the distant look in her eyes when she thought I wasn't watching. Irene's words echoed in my head over the next few days, even when I tried to shake them off. I decided to check our phone records. It felt sneaky, and I hated myself for doing it, but I had to know. And there it was, long calls, mostly in the evenings, to a number I didn't recognize. The same number, over and over. Finding those phone records was like getting punched in the gut. Over and over, that same number kept showing up. Late calls, long ones, often after she'd tell me she was working late or catching up with a friend. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling this mix of anger and humiliation build up in my chest. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the more I thought about it, the more things clicked. She'd been so dismissive, so cold, and all those nights she was busy. It felt like I'd been living in a lie. Part of me wanted to confront her right then, to throw those phone records in her face and demand an explanation. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I called Irene. She picked up right away, and the second she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. Ross? What happened? I told her about the phone records, about the calls to the same number, and I could hear the sympathy in her voice. I'm sorry, Ross. I know this isn't what you wanted to find. She didn't push me to confront Kimberly, though. Instead, she offered something I didn't even think about. Do you want me to check out who that number belongs to? I know some people who could help figure it out. I was hesitant at first, felt like I was crossing a line, but Irene was right there, reassuring me. Ross, you deserve to know. If she's betrayed you, then you have every right to find out. So, I gave her the number. A part of me felt dirty, like I was doing something wrong, but another part of me needed answers. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. There was something real here, something that had been going on behind my back, and I couldn't ignore it. A few days passed before Irene got back to me. We met up at a quiet cafe, and I could tell by the look on her face that she had news. She slid a paper across the table with a name written on it, Randy Martin. I stared at it, trying to process. Randy? I asked, the name feeling foreign and wrong on my tongue. He's a salesman, pretty successful, wealthy, Irene explained, her tone careful, like she didn't want to upset me more than I already was. Apparently, he travels a lot for work. And he's been seeing Kimberly for a while, from what I could gather. I couldn't believe it. Randy Martin. Some smooth-talking, rich salesman. I felt sick to my stomach, this wave of anger and betrayal hitting me all over again. Kimberly hadn't just been slipping away, she'd jumped ship completely. The name Randy Martin kept echoing in my head, like some cruel joke that wouldn't stop. This guy, this flashy salesman with all his travel and money, had just waltzed in and taken over my life without me even knowing. I didn't know if I was more angry at him, at her, or at myself for not seeing it sooner. After I left the cafe, I went home and sat in our empty house, trying to figure out what to do next. Kimberly wasn't home, of course. She'd texted earlier saying she'd be late again. The usual excuse. I stared at that text, gripping my phone so hard my hand started to cramp. That night, I decided to wait up for her. I wanted to look her in the eye, just to see if she could lie to me again, face to face. Midnight came and went, and I finally heard her key in the door. She walked in, surprised to see me still awake. "Oh, you're up," she said, sounding almost irritated. "No, hey, no, how are you?" Just like she couldn't be bothered. "Yeah, figured I'd wait up for my wife," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She barely looked at me, already slipping out of her shoes and heading toward the bedroom like nothing was wrong. I followed her down the hallway. "So, Kimberly, who's Randy?" I asked, dropping the name like a bomb. She froze, and in that split second, I saw everything. Her face went pale, her eyes darted away, and she stammered, "W." I didn't answer, just held her gaze. That's when the lies started pouring out. She went on about how he was just a friend from work, someone she'd been mentoring, nothing more. She tried to laugh it off, like it was ridiculous, like I was imagining things. But the more she talked, the more it hit me how little respect she had for me. She really thought I'd believe her, thought I'd just accept the lame excuses she was throwing at me. And for some reason, that hurt even more. She'd already betrayed me, but the fact that she didn't even try to come up with a decent story, it was like she didn't even care enough to pretend. I cut her off. "I know about the calls, Kimberly. I know he's not just a friend." Her face fell, and for a second, I thought she might tell the truth. But instead, she crossed her arms, putting on this defensive look, like I was the one in the wrong. "Maybe I wouldn't have needed a friend if you were around more, Ross," she snapped. "I didn't sign up for a life where I have to babysit my husband because he can't hold down a job." I just stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. She turned her betrayal into my failure, like I was the reason she'd gone looking for something else. Hearing Kimberly twist things like that hit me harder than I expected. She had taken my job loss, one of the hardest moments of my life, and turned it into some kind of excuse for why she needed another man. As if my struggles gave her a free pass to betray me. I wanted to yell, to say something that would cut her as deep as she just cut me, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I just stood there, trying to keep my voice steady. So, that's it? Because I lost my job, you decided I wasn't enough for you. She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms again like this was just a minor argument. Don't be so dramatic, Ross. You know things have been off between us for a long time. She looked away, her voice suddenly softer, almost like she was talking to herself. Randy. He just reminded me what it feels like to be appreciated. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd loved her for years, supported her through everything, and she needed some guy like Randy to feel appreciated? It was like she'd rewritten our entire marriage in her head to justify what she was doing. So all those late nights at work, all that time you were too tired or too busy, that was all just code for seeing him, wasn't it? I asked, my voice rougher than I'd intended. She didn't answer right away, just looked down at the floor. That was all the confirmation I needed. Unbelievable, I muttered, stepping back. All this time, and you didn't even have the decency to just tell me you weren't happy. Kimberly finally looked up, and there was this flash of anger in her eyes. It's not that simple, Ross. I did love you, but things change. People change. Her tone was almost dismissive, like this was just some unfortunate thing that happened instead of a choice she'd made. Before I knew it, I blurted out, do you even feel sorry at all? Or was our whole marriage just one big act to you? She sighed, looking more annoyed than remorseful. I didn't plan for this to happen. I'm sorry you're hurt, but I needed to do what was best for me. I can't keep living my life feeling stuck. Hearing her say that, I realized there was nothing left to salvage here. She'd made her choice, and she didn't care about the damage she'd caused. For her, it was all about what she wanted, and the life we'd built together was just collateral damage. Without another word, I walked past her, out of the bedroom, and shut the door behind me. It felt like every step I took down the hall was dragging me further away from the life I thought I had. I crashed on the couch, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of betrayal, anger, and something else, something that felt a lot like relief. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Kimberly was already gone, probably off to work, or to see Randy for all I knew. The house felt empty in a way it hadn't before. I kept waiting for the anger to take over, to fuel me, to get me moving, but all I felt was this hollow ache that seemed to settle deep in my chest. I thought back to everything I'd done to keep our marriage going. The times I'd stayed up with her when she was stressed, the anniversaries, the small gestures she used to appreciate. It all felt like it had just vanished into thin air. It was clear she hadn't felt that connection for a while. I realized I was the only one who'd been holding on to it. I spent the day in a daze, just going through the motions, avoiding phone calls, emails, and anything that reminded me of the life I was supposed to have. Around noon, I decided to call Irene. She'd been there through the worst of it, and right now, she was probably the only person who'd actually understand. When she picked up, her voice was calm, comforting, like she'd been waiting for my call. Hey Ross. How are you holding up? I told her everything, how Kimberly had tried to turn it all around on me, like my job loss was the reason she'd been unfaithful. Irene listened, didn't interrupt, just let me spill every frustration, every raw emotion I'd been holding back. And for the first time since this all started, I felt like someone actually heard me. That's brutal, Ross, she finally said. You didn't deserve any of that. It sounds like she just used your struggles as a way to justify her own actions. Classic deflection. Her words hit me hard. She was right. Kimberly hadn't even tried to apologize or take responsibility. She just made excuses, twisted things to make it my fault. I felt this surge of anger, stronger than before, and it was a relief to know someone else saw it too. Listen, Irene said, her tone firmer. You've been carrying the weight of that relationship on your own. Maybe it's time to start thinking about yourself for once. You've done more than enough for someone who clearly didn't value it. There was something in her voice. Support, yes, but something deeper, something that made me feel grounded. It was like she genuinely cared about what happened to me, like my pain wasn't just some abstract thing. We ended the call, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of clarity. Kimberly had made her choice, and maybe it was time for me to make mine. I wasn't going to sit around and let her walk all over me, not anymore. The clarity I felt after talking to Irene was like a lifeline, something I hadn't realized I needed so badly. The more I thought about it, the more I realized she was right. I'd been bending over backward for someone who didn't care. And if Kimberly had already decided to move on with Randy, then maybe it was time I started thinking about my own life without her in it. That night, I decided to go through our things. I wasn't planning to pack up just yet, but I needed to get a grip on what my next steps might be. As I went through some old photos and letters, I found a few that brought me back to the early days when things were good. Part of me wondered if I'd missed signs even back then, but I pushed that thought aside. No point in going down that road. While I was sifting through things, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Kimberly. I half expected it to be some weak attempt at smoothing things over, but it was nothing like that. "I'll be late again. Don't wait up." That was it. "No, I'm sorry. No, are you okay?" It was like she couldn't even pretend to care anymore. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling that hollow ache turn to anger. She was out with him. Again. And she didn't even have the decency to hide it. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't keep living under the same roof, acting like everything was normal. Kimberly clearly didn't care, so why should I? I called Irene, who picked up on the first ring. "I need a break from here," I told her. "I don't know where I'm going, but I can't keep sitting in this house, just waiting for her to come back from." I cut myself off, feeling my voice shake. "You're doing the right thing, Ross," Irene said softly. "You deserve better than this." She paused, then added, "I've got a spare room if you need a place to clear your head." The offer caught me off guard. Irene had always been supportive, but this felt different. Part of me hesitated, but the idea of being anywhere but here was too tempting to pass up. I packed a small bag, just the essentials, and left a note for Kimberly on the kitchen counter. "I'm done waiting up. Don't bother calling." I drove over to Irene's, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt. When I arrived, she opened the door, a warm smile on her face, and led me inside. She didn't ask questions or push me to talk, she just gave me a space to breathe. That night, we sat in her living room, talking about anything but Kimberly. For the first time in weeks, I felt human again. Not like some discarded piece of someone else's life, but like I actually mattered to someone. It was a small thing, but it gave me strength. In that quiet space with Irene, I realized I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Staying at Irene's felt like a breath of fresh air. I'd been suffocating in that house, drowning in memories and unanswered questions. But here, with Irene, I could finally clear my head. She kept things casual, didn't press for details unless I wanted to talk. It was like she knew exactly what I needed. A few days passed, and in that time, I started seeing things from a new angle. I'd always thought of myself as someone who could tough things out, but losing my job and my marriage back-to-back had knocked me down in a way I hadn't been prepared for. It was hard to face the fact that Kimberly hadn't been the person I thought she was, and I couldn't help wondering if I'd been blind to the signs or if she'd just changed over the years. One evening, we were sitting in Irene's kitchen, talking about random things. She told me stories from her childhood, funny little memories that had us both laughing. It felt natural, easy, and I was surprised by how comfortable I felt around her. At one point, she reached across the table and put her hand on mine, just a light touch, but it sent a spark through me I hadn't felt in a long time. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "you don't deserve any of this, Ross. You've always been a good guy, and none of this is on you." Hearing that from her, someone who knew me so well, made me feel seen. It was more than just sympathy. It was like she genuinely cared about my happiness, something I hadn't felt from Kimberly in a long time. We sat there, holding each other's gaze, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. Just as I was about to say something, my phone buzzed, breaking the spell. I glanced at it and saw Kimberly's name flashing on the screen. My heart sank. I hadn't heard from her since I'd left, and part of me had hoped I never would. Reluctantly, I picked up. "Ross," Kimberly's voice sounded cold, almost irritated. "I came home, and all your things are gone. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "What's going on is that I'm done, Kimberly. I'm done waiting around while you sneak off with Randy." She scoffed, like this was somehow ridiculous to her. "So, you're just going to walk away? Just like that?" I felt a surge of anger. "Walk away? You're the one who left first, Kimberly. You checked out of this marriage long before I did. I'm just following your lead." There was a long silence, then she muttered something about how she didn't expect me to be so dramatic. Before I could respond, she hung up. I put the phone down, feeling a strange sense of finality. Irene looked at me, her eyes filled with understanding. "You did the right thing, Ross," she said, her voice steady. "She didn't deserve you." Sitting there in that quiet kitchen with Irene by my side, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was ready to move on. After that call, it was like a weight lifted off me. I'd been hanging on to some last thread of hope that maybe Kimberly would realize what she'd thrown away. But hearing her brush everything off, treating my pain like it was some kind of inconvenience, I finally understood there was nothing left to fight for. In the days that followed, I settled into a kind of routine at Irene's place. I was still figuring out what to do next, but being around her kept me grounded. Every morning, she'd make coffee and sit with me on the back porch, chatting about everything from work to whatever was happening in the neighborhood. It was simple, easy, and exactly what I needed. One evening, Irene suggested we go out for a drink. "Come on, it'll be good for you to get out," she said, giving me that warm, encouraging smile that I'd come to rely on. I hesitated for a second, but I could see she wasn't going to let me stay holed up forever. We ended up at this cozy bar downtown, a place with dim lights and a laid-back vibe. As we settled into a booth, I noticed how relaxed I felt. No tension, no need to be on guard. Just me and Irene, two friends enjoying a night out. Over a couple of drinks, our conversation took a deeper turn. Irene asked me about my dreams, my goals, things I hadn't thought about in months. "You were always so passionate about your work, Ross," she said. "What do you really want to do now?" I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't done in a long time. I told her about my career, the things I'd wanted to accomplish, and the parts of myself that I'd set aside over the years to keep things stable for Kimberly. As I spoke, I realized how much I'd lost. Not just Kimberly, but pieces of myself. And now, sitting there with Irene, I felt a glimpse of possibility, like maybe there was a chance to get those pieces back. She listened intently, nodding along, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she reached across the table, giving my hand a gentle squeeze. "Ross, you deserve happiness, real happiness. And I think you'll find it, once you let go of all the things that don't serve you anymore." The words struck a chord. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but she was right. I'd been holding on to a version of my life that didn't exist anymore, trying to patch up something that had been broken for a long time. As we left the bar that night, Irene looped her arm through mine, and we walked side by side under the streetlights. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like everything. I realized I wasn't just finding my way out of a broken marriage. I was starting to see a future again, one that might just include Irene. The night at the bar with Irene stayed with me long after we got back. That quiet moment we shared as we walked home together. It felt like a promise, a glimpse into something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The next morning, we fell into our usual routine. Irene had already made coffee, and we sat on the porch, watching the sun come up. I felt a new sense of calm, something I hadn't felt since all this started. I could see Irene glancing at me, like she could tell something was shifting. "You look lighter," she said, smiling into her coffee cup. "Guess I am," I admitted. "I think I'm finally ready to let go of everything with Kimberly. Just put it behind me." Irene nodded, her face lighting up with that familiar warmth. "I'm glad, Ross. You deserve to feel free again." The day went by quickly. I took some time to look into job leads, feeling a fresh sense of motivation. The idea of moving forward, of building a new life, actually excited me. And every time I felt myself slipping back into old worries, Irene was there, pulling me back to the present with her easy laugh or a quick reassuring touch on the shoulder. That evening, Irene cooked dinner, a simple pasta with garlic bread, but it tasted better than anything I'd had in months. We ate at her small kitchen table, just the two of us, and the comfort of it all made me forget the chaos I'd come from. After dinner, we moved to the couch, sharing stories about our old coworkers at Uni-G, laughing about office drama and strange clients. I hadn't laughed like that in so long. When the conversation lulled, there was a quiet, meaningful pause. Irene looked at me, her expression soft and open, and before I knew it, we were leaning toward each other. And then, just like that, we were kissing. It was gentle at first, cautious, as if we were both testing the waters. But in that kiss, I felt everything I'd been missing: comfort, understanding, warmth. When we finally pulled back, she looked at me, her face flushed but her eyes bright. I didn't plan on that happening," I said, feeling my cheeks go red. Irene laughed softly, her hand still resting on my arm. "Neither did I. But I don't regret it. Neither did I." In that quiet moment, with Irene by my side, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things were finally falling into place. That kiss changed everything. It was like all the pain and confusion of the last few months melted away, leaving something simple and real in its place. For the first time, I felt grounded, like I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for. The next few days with Irene were different, better somehow. There was this unspoken understanding between us, a quiet comfort in knowing that we were no longer just friends but something more. We didn't talk about it directly, didn't put labels on anything, but we both knew. One morning, as we sat on the porch with our coffee, she finally broke the silence. "So what's next for you, Ross? I mean, really. Have you thought about what you want now?" I took a deep breath, thinking about her question. "Honestly, I want a fresh start," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "A new job, a new place. I don't know exactly where or what, but I need to rebuild. And I want to do it right this time." She nodded, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Then let's make that happen. You've got a clean slate, Ross. You get to decide what your life looks like now." It hit me then that she was serious, that she genuinely wanted to help me find my way forward. And the thought of her being part of that future made the idea of starting over feel exciting. I hadn't felt that way in a long time. Over the next few days, Irene helped me put together a new resume and started reaching out to her contacts. She even pulled some strings with a former boss of hers and got me an interview at a smaller tech firm across town. It wasn't Uni-G, but it was a solid opportunity, and I felt more motivated than I had in months. One evening, after a long day of prep, Irene surprised me by pulling out a bottle of wine. "A toast," she said, raising her glass. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," I repeated, clinking my glass against hers. As the night wore on, we talked about everything, the good, the bad, and all the things we still wanted out of life. Sitting there, laughing and sharing dreams with Irene, I realized that my old life was finally behind me. I wasn't Ross, the husband left behind. I was Ross, starting over, with someone by my side who truly cared about me. And for the first time, that didn't feel like settling. It felt like the start of something real. The morning of the interview, I woke up early, nerves and excitement buzzing through me. Irene had already set out a fresh cup of coffee and a plate of toast, giving me a reassuring smile as I sat down. "You're going to do great," she said, squeezing my hand. "Just be yourself, and they'll see what I see." I chuckled, trying to mask my nerves. "Thanks. I really need this, you know." Irene nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "Whatever happens, you're already moving forward. You're not that guy sitting on the couch, waiting on someone who doesn't care. This," she gestured around us, her eyes bright, "this is a fresh start, Ross. You've got this." Her words stayed with me as I drove to the interview. And sure enough, I felt calm, clear-headed, like I'd finally stepped out of a fog. The interview went well, the team was welcoming, and they seemed genuinely interested in my experience. It wasn't the kind of job I'd had before, but I could see myself there, building something new. On my way back to Irene's, I got a text from Kimberly. Seeing her name pop up on my screen sent a chill down my spine, even though I'd thought I was past it. I pulled over to read the message. "Hey, I want to talk. I think we need to discuss things. Let me know when you're free." It felt out of the blue, but knowing Kimberly, it wasn't surprising. The message was vague, and that was typical of her. No apology, no acknowledgement of the damage she'd done, just a casual request to talk, as if we could just pick up where we left off. I could feel my stomach twist with frustration. When I got back, Irene noticed my expression right away. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. I handed her my phone, letting her read the text. She looked at me, a hint of worry in her eyes. "What do you think she wants?" "I don't know," I said, sighing. "But whatever it is, I don't think it's anything good." Irene put a hand on my shoulder, her touch grounding me. "You don't owe her anything, Ross. You've made it this far without her, and you don't need to get dragged back into that mess." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. She was right. I didn't owe Kimberly a single thing. But a part of me still wanted to know what she had to say, if only to get the closure I never got when I walked out. Later that night, after talking it over with Irene, I decided to meet Kimberly in a public place, a neutral ground where I could hear her out without getting pulled into her web. As I sat there waiting, I felt strangely calm. I'd come a long way from the broken man she'd left behind, and I was ready to face whatever she had to throw at me. When Kimberly finally walked in, I saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes. I realized in that moment that I didn't feel the same anger. I was just done. Sitting across from Kimberly in that coffee shop felt surreal. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, I would have given anything to save what we had. Now looking at her, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. She fidgeted, tapping her nails on the table as if she wasn't sure how to start. Finally, she looked up, meeting my eyes with that familiar guarded expression. "Ross, I know things have been tense between us." She sighed, like she was trying to play the part of a wounded partner, and honestly, it made me sick. "Tense?" I repeated, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. "I'd say it's a bit more than that." She shifted uncomfortably, but pressed on. I didn't expect you to actually leave like that," she admitted. "One day you're here, and the next you're gone." It felt sudden. That was the breaking point. Sudden. I shot back, my voice low but sharp. "Kimberly, you left this marriage a long time before I did. I just finally had the courage to walk out of a house that you'd already abandoned. All I did was follow your lead." She looked taken aback, like she hadn't expected me to confront her so directly. For a moment, I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She crossed her arms, her tone shifting to one of defense. "I know I wasn't perfect, Ross, but you have to understand. I needed something different, something more. And I didn't think you could give me that anymore." Her words hit like a punch, but this time, the pain wasn't sharp, it was dull, like something I'd already accepted long ago. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "So that's it then? I wasn't enough for you, so you found someone who was." She didn't answer, just stared down at her hands, and in that silence, everything became clear. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done, she was only sorry that it had finally cost her something. "Kimberly," I said, my voice firm, "you could have come to me, told me you weren't happy. We could have worked on it, or ended things before it got to this point. But you chose to lie, to sneak around with Randy, and you made me question everything we had." I paused, watching as my words settled over her. "If you wanted something more, then fine, but you didn't have to burn everything down to get it." She looked up, her face unreadable, but there was a flash of something, maybe regret. I didn't think it would go this way," she muttered. "I thought we'd find a way to get past it, that maybe you'd understand." "Understand?" I almost laughed. "You wanted me to just accept that you betrayed me and go back to pretending everything was fine?" She looked away, and I realized she didn't have an answer. She had no plan beyond doing what she wanted, no intention of facing the consequences. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built my life around, was gone, and in her place was someone who barely recognized the damage she'd done. "I don't need closure from you, Kimberly," I said, my voice steady. "I came here hoping you'd be honest with me, maybe even apologize. But I see now that you're just not capable of that." She finally looked up, her expression a mix of frustration and something that almost looked like fear. "Ross, it's not like that. I didn't mean for it to end like this. I thought we had something strong. I repeated, shaking my head. "Strong relationships don't involve lies and betrayal, Kimberly. Strong relationships are built on trust. And that's something you destroyed." She opened her mouth to say something, but I held up a hand, stopping her. "I'm done, Kimberly. There's nothing left to say. I wish you the best, but whatever we had, it's over. And I'm moving on." With that, I stood up, leaving her sitting there, speechless. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt an odd mixture of sadness and relief. I'd given her a chance to come clean, to take responsibility, and she hadn't. But it didn't matter. I'd finally closed that chapter for myself. Walking back to my car, I felt a new strength, a lightness in my steps. I knew deep down that I'd done the right thing. I'd let go, left the past behind, and for the first time in a long time, I could see a future that was mine to shape. And when I thought of that future, I didn't see Kimberly. I saw Irene. Leaving that coffee shop felt like shedding old skin. I got in my car, closed the door, and just sat there for a moment, letting the reality sink in. It was over, not in a bitter, heartbreaking way, but with a calm finality I hadn't known I needed. I'd walked away from Kimberly, from the resentment and anger, and somewhere in all that mess, I'd reclaimed a piece of myself. On the drive back, my mind wandered to Irene. I thought about everything she'd done for me, how she'd been my steady support through the darkest time of my life. And not just as a friend, she was more than that now, something I couldn't quite label but knew was real. She was my starting point, my anchor, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply I felt for her. By the time I got to her house, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and excitement. I parked, walked up to the door, and before I could even knock, she opened it, a warm smile lighting up her face. "Hey, you're back," she said, her voice as gentle as ever. "How did it go?" I stepped inside, and without thinking, I reached out and pulled her into a hug. She didn't resist, just wrapped her arms around me, her touch grounding me in a way I hadn't felt before. "It's over," I said quietly, letting the words settle. Whatever she needed to say, it doesn't matter. "I'm done, Irene. Done with all of it." She pulled back slightly, looking up at me, her eyes searching my face. "Are you okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, actually. For the first time in a long time, I am." She smiled, her hand resting on my arm, and I could see relief and pride in her expression. She knew what this meant for me, understood the weight of it without me having to explain. We moved into the living room, and I recounted the meeting, sparing no detail about Kimberly's lack of remorse and her inability to take responsibility for what she'd done. Irene listened, not interrupting, just letting me get it all out. By the end, I felt lighter, like I'd dropped a boulder I'd been carrying around for months. "She never really thought this through," I said, shaking my head. I gave her a chance to explain, to own up, but she couldn't do it. And I don't think she ever will. Irene placed her hand over mine, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I'm proud of you, Ross. It takes strength to let go of something like that, to walk away when someone's hurt you so deeply. It shows how much you've grown." Her words hit me harder than I'd expected. I looked at her, realizing how much I owed to her support. She had been there every step of the way, guiding me, helping me pick up the pieces, and now she was the one I wanted to share this new life with. I'd never felt so certain of anything in my life. After a long silence, I cleared my throat, gathering my courage. "Irene, I don't know if I'd be here without you. You've been my rock, my friend, and I just want you to know how much you mean to me." She blushed slightly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "You don't have to thank me, Ross. I'm just glad I could be here for you." "No, it's more than that," I said, my voice firmer now. "It's not just that you helped me through a hard time. You've shown me what real support looks like, what it means to actually be there for someone. And it's made me realize that I want more than just friendship with you. I want us to be something real." She looked up, her eyes wide, a mixture of surprise and happiness in her expression. "Ross, she paused, and I could see her trying to find the words. "I never expected this, but I felt the same way. I didn't know if you were ready, if this was what you wanted." "It's all I want," I replied, reaching out to take her hand. "You've been my steady place in a world that fell apart. And I don't want to keep holding back. I'm ready for a fresh start, Irene, one that includes you." For a moment, we just sat there, holding hands, the weight of our words hanging in the air. Finally she smiled, a smile that lit up her whole face, and leaned in, resting her forehead against mine. "I'd like that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That night, we didn't talk much more. We didn't need to. We just stayed close, enjoying each other's presence, letting the warmth of the moment speak for itself. For the first time in months, I went to bed feeling whole, knowing that whatever lay ahead, I wasn't facing it alone. The next morning felt like the first day of a new life. Irene and I had breakfast together, the simple routine feeling intimate and easy, like we'd been doing this forever. We talked about my job prospects, plans for the future, and all the little details that came with rebuilding a life from scratch. A week later, I got a call back from the tech firm. They wanted to hire me. It was a good role, with opportunities for growth, and best of all, it was a fresh start. I accepted the offer without hesitation, eager to step into this new chapter with Irene by my side. As the days turned into weeks, our lives started to settle into a rhythm. I moved my things into her place, and little by little, we built a home together. It wasn't the grand, dramatic love story I once thought I needed. It was quiet, steady, filled with laughter and shared coffee on the porch. And for the first time in years, I felt content. One evening, as we sat outside watching the sunset, Irene leaned her head on my shoulder. "I think we make a good team, Ross," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. I wrapped my arm around her, feeling a peace I hadn't known before. "Yeah," I replied, smiling. "I think so too." And that was enough. More than enough, actually. We didn't need grand gestures or endless promises. Just being here together was all the happiness I could have asked for. I'd lost so much, but in the end, I'd found something better, something real. For the first time, I could see a life ahead of me, and it was a life I actually wanted. Months passed, and life settled into something I hadn't thought possible after everything that happened, a new normal. Every morning, I woke up next to Irene, feeling lucky to have a second chance, a real one. We both had our routines, our separate lives that intersected in all the right ways, but there was a simplicity and peace to it that made me feel whole again. Work at the new tech firm turned out to be everything I'd hoped for. It wasn't uni-G, but that was a good thing. I was in a place that appreciated what I brought to the table, with people who valued my work without the corporate drama I'd dealt with for years. The job gave me focus, something to strive for again. And every day I came home to Irene, knowing I had something stable to build on. One evening, we were sitting in the backyard, surrounded by the quiet of the neighborhood, the sun just dipping below the horizon. Irene brought out 2 glasses of wine and sat down beside me, handing me one. We clinked glasses, settling into the silence. She looked over at me, her eyes full of warmth, and said, "Did you ever think we'd end up here? I mean, everything you went through, everything I went through. It's like it all led to this." I took a sip, thinking about her words. She was right. Looking back, it was like all the pain, all the betrayals, every single step had somehow guided us to each other. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd lose my job, my marriage, and end up here with you, I would have called you crazy, I said, chuckling. She laughed, nodding. Yeah, I wouldn't have believed it either. But now that we're here, I can't imagine it any other way. We sat quietly, just taking in the stillness of the evening. Being with Irene felt different than anything I'd ever known. It wasn't the wild head-over-heels romance I'd always thought I needed. It was something deeper, something steady. And that meant more to me than any grand gesture or whirlwind romance. "Irene," I started, setting my glass down and turning to face her. "I know this has all been unexpected, but I want you to know how much you mean to me. You didn't just pull me out of the worst time in my life. You gave me a reason to start over, to actually look forward to something." She smiled softly, reaching for my hand. "You've done the same for me, Ross. It's funny, isn't it? Sometimes we think we know exactly what we want, and then life throws a curveball, and suddenly, we're somewhere completely different but exactly where we need to be." Her words settled over me, and I felt this incredible warmth, this certainty that I hadn't felt in years. I realized that with Irene, I wasn't just healing, I was rebuilding. Together, we'd created something out of the ruins of our old lives, and it was more real, more genuine than anything I'd known before. The night stretched on, filled with soft laughter and quiet moments, neither of us rushing or expecting anything more than what was right there between us. Eventually, as the stars filled the sky, I leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead, letting the simplicity of that moment speak for itself. The next day, as I got ready for work, Irene surprised me with an envelope. "What's this?" I asked, glancing up at her. She grinned. "Just a little something I thought might be fun." Inside was a set of plane tickets, 2 tickets to a cabin in the mountains for a long weekend. I figured it's time we get away for a bit, just the 2 of us. No work, no reminders of everything that happened, just us, she said, her eyes shining. I felt a grin spread across my face. You know, I don't think I've looked forward to something this much in a long time. A few days later, we were off, bags packed, driving into the mountains. The trip was simple, but it was everything I'd hoped it would be. Quiet mornings drinking coffee on the porch, long hikes through the woods, nights spent talking by the fire, our laughter echoing in the cabin. On the last morning, as we sat watching the sunrise over the mountains, Irene took my hand. "I don't need anything more than this, Ross. Whatever life brings, I just want to go through it with you." I squeezed her hand, feeling that same certainty I'd felt the night we first kissed. "Then let's do it. Let's build something together, something that's ours." In that moment, I realized how far I'd come. I'd been broken, betrayed, and left behind. But here I was, with someone who'd seen me at my worst and stayed anyway. With Irene, I wasn't just surviving, I was living, building something real, something I could hold on to. And for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. As the sun rose higher, painting the world in shades of gold, I knew without a doubt that I was finally home.
Bye.